because everyone's here and Heidi's on the phone. So I will now call to order the THPRD Board of Directors work session for September 14th, 2022. Jessica, will you please take roll?
Felicita Monteblanco.
Here.
Barbie Miner.
Here.
Alfredo Moreno.
Here.
Heidi Edwards.
Here.
Tia Ping.
Here.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the time set aside for a work session. This is typically a learning opportunity, whether it has to do with programming or how we do our work. And I couldn't be more excited to invite Corey into our space and to learn more today about disability justice. And this is really, a primer, a 101. And if you have more questions at the end, then I think Corey did a really great job. So I will hand it over to Corey.
Yes, hi everyone. It's great to meet you. And it's been great to learn more about your work in this process. So I'm excited to join you all. And I've heard that you all have been doing a lot of learning and work together. And so this is an audience that's open to learning, which is always my favorite to be a part of. So really excited for that. A little bit about myself, just so you know who I am and coming into the space. My name is Corey Leda. I use she and they pronouns. I am a disability justice activist, a fat activist, an abolitionist. I do a lot of community organizing work and community building and cultural work. And I also work at Portland State University as the assistant director of the Women's Resource Center there. And so I do a lot of work supporting young adults and supporting their education and learning within that space. And so I kind of have my multiple hats that I wear, and it's something that I really love, that I get to partner with different groups as an educator, as a thought partner, to share more about both my lived experience and also different kinds of justice frameworks and how they really can be integrated into the different kinds of work that we do that's moving forward the needle towards greater access, greater self-determination and liberation. So that's a little bit about me. So I will share my screen, and I believe I sent the link along, so you should have access to this at some point, if not already. Let me know if that's something you'd like me to drop in the chat, and I can also do that too. So
typically, are you talking about slides?
Yeah.
Yeah, so slides can, Jessica's always really good about making sure we have slides afterwards, but
Right.
I guess she's going to show us.
Yeah, let me actually just put it in our space together real quickly if I can figure that out. I'm used to using Zoom more than Teams, so you'll have to forgive me for that piece. Yeah, I think I'll wait on sharing that just because I'm not sure what's the best way to do that. But I'll make sure you get the link either way, because I really want this to be a resource that you can turn to, because an hour is never enough time. And I know I'm a learner who likes to sit with things and return to things, and I included a lot of resources there for you as well. So let me share my screen and we'll go from there. Let me get this all set up here.
And I should have added, Corey, as you do that. I've been lucky enough to learn about this framework through work and be connected to Corey through work. And so I'm just really grateful that I get to bring this. I am a learner in this space as well. The project that Corey works on with my organization, I'm actually not terribly involved in. So I'm a learner today too.
Yeah, that's one of my more recent consulting pieces I've done that I've been really excited to do, which is partner with Northwest Health Foundation to really manage the Advancing Disability Justice Grant Program. So that's been something that I've really enjoyed this year. All right, let me share this with you. And if you have any need for me to, shift anything we're looking at, let me know. So I introduced myself a little bit, and I wanted to start off by saying that, typically I would love to have time where we can talk more in a learning space, but since this is an hour, I'm going to go through the material and it'll be mostly listening. And at at any point you can, either go off mute and say something or flag my attention, and I'm happy to pause, but I'll just kind of be chugging along here. But that, totally welcome to questions. So I start with really grounding us in like what we even think about when we think about disability and disabled community. And I think for most of us who've been socialized and educated specifically in the United States or in Western influenced learning spaces, we think about disability and disabled community with kind of the frameworks of like there's something broken about someone or damaged or incomplete, whether that's like something we can actually see, like a missing limb, or maybe something that's like about what a person can't or can do anymore. And it's really framed around like what, someone is capable or not capable of doing. And so with that, I think comes a lot of this like framing or narrative or assumptions around dependency or unattractiveness or uneducated. And I think a lot of times disabled community is really seen as like not as smart or not as, a peer within thought partnership. And along with that, I think we often focus on visible disabilities and don't really consider all the kinds of disabilities that go within the umbrella of disabled experience. And then, I think when we do see disability in maybe a more positive light, is often from this place of like inspiration, right? Like, wow, look at that, person who still managed to do X, Y, and Z despite their, disability, right? And, I think that we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I think a lot of that, does play into kind of this idea of our bodies as being situated in what we're able to contribute, really often as workers. And so, that might be like what someone's able to do based on the baseline of what someone's should be able to contribute in the world as like a good human with a body or a good citizen in our society. So what I would like to, and normally I'd be like, let's all talk about like how we learn these things or our own experience with that. I'm going to assume that we all have a relationship to being at least can relate to having had these thoughts before or see how they're present in our communities and our culture. And so what I kind of like to start off with is what I think is missing, some of the key things just from the start, which is that there's a lot of invisible disabilities. Myself, I have primarily invisible disabilities myself. And, it's been my own relationship to identifying as a disabled person, knowing that there's, really different kinds of lived experiences with disabilities. And so, just calling out that there are quite a few of us who live with invisible disabilities, that there's an actual disabled identity, that people have pride over being disabled or feel that it's part of their multiple identities, is that being disabled is included in that. So for instance, myself, identify as fat, I identify as disabled, I identify as queer, as, Latina and Indigenous. And so, those are all part of what make me who I am. And it's not part of like a negative thing that I'm trying to hide, right? And with that there is actually culture, this, a disabled community that has culture, and many kinds of different disabled communities. And, for instance, I have a parent and loved ones who belong to the hard of hearing and deaf community, and that is a very strong culture and community that I think people, once they think about it, can really see that like, oh, yeah, that makes sense that there's a community there. And, like that, there's a lot of different kinds of disabled community that exists. I think what's also missing is like that space for complexity. Not everyone has a disability is proud of being disabled. Not everyone has a disability identifies as disabled. There's a lot of different pieces there. And with that comes the inability to create a homogenous experience when we talk about disabled community. And, I think alongside that is really moving beyond representation. And so I think with that kind of piece on the last slide around, when we think about inspiration, it's often like, oh, wow, it's so cool to see this disabled person, also being able to run a race or also being able to do this. And then it stops there. And I think for many of us who have multiply marginalized experiences or any kind of experience of being othered or oppressed, we know that for us to truly have equity, we can't just stop at representation. It's not enough. It's actually about shifting power and shifting leadership so that there's more than just that piece. Access intimacy is another thing that is a large part of the conversation around disability that I think folks don't have the language for, and it's a term coined by Mia Mingus, who talks a lot about the kind of intimacy that's created when people are interdependent and need support from each other. And so access intimacy could be what happens between partners who might be able-bodied and disabled, and the kind of intimacy that lives between those folks in getting needs met. It can be disabled people supporting disabled people, but it's the kind of intimacy that is created and valued and should be uplifted when it comes to creating and increasing and maintaining access. And so, the other pieces I think are pieces we'll talk a little bit more about in a few more slides, but I just want to name that I think often missing in the conversation about the experience for folks with disabilities is the creativity and resilience and resistance that's part of surviving this world, and with that the self-determination to really decide what we need and how we need it and what that looks like, as being the experts in our own lived experience and our own needs. And I think that this is something that often doesn't really get talked about in our mainstream conversations about disability. And that, I've already spoken kind of to the multiple and marginalized experience and how people, like myself, include disabled identity as part of those pieces, but understanding that, my experience as a disabled person is also informed by my queerness, informed by my size, informed by my navigation through the world as someone who is, a person of color, but also has a lot of proximity to whiteness. All those things inform each other. And, to separate them out does an injustice to those lived experiences. And so when we talk a lot about racial equity, what does it mean to then maybe talk about disabled experience within racial equity and how they inform each other? And then, the last piece, which is one that I really, really care about, is not letting the conversation about disability be solely located in the individual experiences of people or in the communal, relational piece, but really expand those conversations to talk about the societal and structural conditions that both impact disabled people, that impact who becomes disabled, the resources for disabled people, and so on. And so really thinking through not just the, the lived realities for the individuals, but those real important both systemic oppression issues, but also those opportunities for change that go beyond the individual person. I know I talked a lot, so I'm going to pause real quick because I just threw a lot at you and just check for any questions before I move on. Because I threw new terms out there, just a lot of things. Okay. I just don't like to move too fast, but also give a moment. All right, I'm going to keep going, but feel free to toss something out there. All right. So, for most of us, we are familiar with a rights framework when we talk about disability. So you will hear a lot about the disability rights movement. And that is a really great place to start. It's where I hope we don't stay. And so the disability rights framework, the disability rights movement is really about with youth in any way, there's often this framework of like a strength-based approach, as opposed to a deficit-based approach of looking at things. And I think disability justice is one practice in taking a strength-based approach to how we think about people, bodies, and what we are able to do, and our contributions to the world. And so I think this quote touches on that. And so I'm going to catch my breath and play a video for us by Mia Mingus, who I referenced earlier, who's a disability justice activist who has coined, access intimacy, does a lot of really important work in this movement, and has this really nice 3.5-minute long video that really captures a lot of these points. So she says it better than me. So I'm going to play this and hopefully it works. So let me get this queued up. Oh, I think, there we go.
Yeah, there's like 3 main pieces I feel like to disability justice that I think are important right now. One is that it's a multi-issue politic, which is just a fancy way of saying that it's not single issue. It's not just talking about disability. It's talking about, we're including class, we're including race, we're including gender, citizenship. I'm thinking about colonization, thinking about, war and militarization, like all of those things. It is a multi-issue politic, right? That it's not just about ableism and disability, that it's also about other systems of oppression, institutions, and forms of violence. Because disabled people aren't just disabled people. We are also mothers and fathers and women and trans people and queer people and young people and old people. We are so many things, and there's so many things that impact, for example, my life. It's not just ableism, like that I also need to be able to talk about and think through. The other piece is that it is moving away from just like a rights-based and kind of like equality model. So it's not just about like, how do we expand the ranks of the privileged to include a few more people? It's actually saying like, no, we don't want to just expand the ranks of the privileged and just, what usually happens is just to add a few more people who had privileges and were at the top of that group anyways, who's getting included. But it's actually saying and questioning like that whole system, and that why some people are constantly and perpetually at the bottom, right? And who never get included into that expanded ranks. It's talking about redistribution. It's also saying, we don't necessarily believe that what am I trying to say? That approach is necessarily going to work anyways. There's nothing that has shown us that simply expanding the ranks of the privileged to add a few more people has actually led us to a more just world. And then the last piece of it is that it's really talking about what justice and liberation would look like, not just equality, which is very different than justice, but what justice and liberation would look like for disabled people and our communities. So again, not just disability and not just, I think for me, like what liberation would look like for me is not just liberation for my disabled communities that I'm a part of, but also for the queer and trans people of color communities that I'm a part of, also the Korean communities that I'm a part of, also the radical women of color communities that I'm a part of. So it's also talking about connecting disabled people to our communities, which I think is so important, especially in a society and kind of like moment in history and a history and a legacy of people who have been doing, where it's been so individualized, right? Like our notions of justice are so individualized in terms of like, oh, you sue somebody and you get a settlement and that's justice, or oh, you send that person who hurt you to jail and that's justice. No, we're talking about a much more collective form of what justice would look like, and hopefully deeper form.
All right. I love that video because I think she says so much in 3 minutes and 26 seconds. But there's a lot to unpack there, and so I'm going to show you what many activists together have created as the framework, the 10 principles of disability justice. And so, in thinking through kind of what we've talked about so far, a lot of these core concepts, it's more than disability rights, it's more than physical access. It's really centered on collective liberation and collective access and collective care. And so that often looks like mutual aid and universal design. That all bodies are good bodies, all bodies are unique and essential. That all social justice and social change work must integrate disability justice, and dismantling ableism and systems of oppression individually and structurally are like what we actually are talking about here. It's not just that like representation, as I mentioned before. And so I'm going to read this long quote. I apologize for a long quote, but sometimes you just have to do it. And so this is by Patty Byrne, who really was the one who concretized this framework. And so she writes, a disability justice framework understands that all bodies are unique and essential, that all bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We know that we are powerful not despite the complexity of our bodies, but because of them. We understand that all bodies are caught in these bindings of ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation state, and imperialism, and that we cannot separate them. These are the positions from where we struggle. We are in a global system that is incompatible with life. There is no way to stop a single gear in motion. We must dismantle this machine. Disability justice holds a vision born out of collective struggle, drawing upon the legacy of cultural and spiritual resistance within 1,000 underground paths, igniting small, persistent fires of rebellion in everyday life. Disabled people, the global majority, Black and Brown people, share common ground, confronting and subverting colonial powers in our struggle for life and justice. There has always been resistance to all forms of oppression, as we know through our bones that there have simultaneously been disabled people visioning a world where we flourish, that values and celebrates us all in our myriad beauty. So, I think I'll say here that, this is a very explicitly, I would argue, political framework. And I think with that, some of these things get often framed as radical or political in a certain light. And I, have been doing the kind of work of bringing this to a lot of different groups and a lot of people. And I kind of would push back on some of that in the sense that I think that liberation, and when we talk about liberation and resistance to oppression and rebellion and all these things, are inherently concepts that we should not shy away from, but instead embrace as like frameworks that may make us uncomfortable, but lead us to conversations we need to have. And so, I just offer that because I think especially within more formalized work, we don't often talk about things in these ways, but they are, I think, conversations that are important for us to start thinking about, like what our relationship to these things are and how we might be actually doing work that already supports this. Because I actually think that every choice we make is political. And so, we can talk about that more too, but I just want to name that because I know that reading something like this, there is like a certain, lens to it, right? I just want to acknowledge that and also, invite people to maybe just stay there a little bit instead of, what might come up. So these are the 10 principles of disability justice. So these are all housed on a website called Sins Invalid. That's where Patty Byrne works and what she founded. And these are spelled, there's a much longer version of these that you can access, and I'll show you some of that in a moment. But I want to just go through each one. And so the 10 principles of disability justice, intersectionality, we do not live single issue lives, by Audre Lorde. Leadership of those most impacted, we are led by those who must most know these systems, Aurora Levins-Morales. Anti-capitalist politics, commitment to cross-movement organizing, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. And so, I would say in many ways, this is like what we mean when we talk about justice work. These are not only relevant to disabled community, but they are absolutely foundational to the kind of world that many of us who are disabled want to live in, right? We want to have our wholeness recognized. We want to be interdependent. We want collective access. we want to be defined through non-capitalistic means, right? We want to be able to live in a world where all parts of ourselves are recognized within that intersectionality and so on. And so kind of spending a little bit more time on these, I think the ones that, are probably most understood are like intersectionally, right? We talk about that a lot when we talk about equity work, the ability to hold the multiplicity of identity and think about, what experiences, mean for people who have multiple experiences of marginalization and how those get compounded. Leadership of those most impacted. I think again within equity work, we talk about like, how do we actually talk about lived experience, right? Who knows firsthand what it's like to be disabled within your spaces, and how are they in leadership? How are their voices heard? How are their lived experiences centered and prioritized within work that really impacts decisions that are going to impact the disabled community, right? Anti-capitalist politics. And so I think, whether you identify as an anti-capitalist or not, I think we can recognize that capitalism has greatly hurt people, and that capitalism as a way of defining our experience and our lives really narrows what our worth is. And so when we look beyond defining us through our ability to work or not work, or work well or not work well, we get outside of productivity as a way of defining worth. And so what does that mean when we talk about bodies, right? Cross movement solidarity. And so this is where we talk about how disability justice has to be in alignment and with relationship to other kinds of justice frameworks, whether that's racial justice or environmental justice and so on. And so, this is where also there's cross-movement solidarity within disability, right? And so whether that's like deaf community and, spinal injury community coming together, or, fat liberation activists and disabled activists coming together to talk about what it means to live in the world and othered bodies. That we have to have that cross-movement solidarity to create a shared understanding and a shared power in asking and demanding what we know we need to, get rid of oppression. Recognizing wholeness. Each person is full of history and lived experience. Just that alone, I think, is something that can be elevated more in our spaces. And so recognizing all the different ways in which our wholeness as a human is often asked to be left at the door, and like, what does it mean when we're invited and seen within our whole selves? Sustainability. And so, I think there's an interesting conversation to be had around sustainability and the work of Tema Agun and white supremacy culture, and like, what is urgency and what is, dominant culture's expectation around how we move and how fast we move through work, whether that's like the urgency to make decisions as opposed to taking the time we need to make the right one, to invite the right people. And so, a lot of that goes into how we build sustainable work, work that is actually deep and slow and transformative. And then commitment to cross-disability solidarity is kind of what I was talking about, like within disabled community. Interdependence is something that I think is a concept that means a lot. And so sometimes I struggle with like how to be succinct about this, but I think that what I'll say with this one is that, especially for those of us who are part of creating opportunities for people or programming or resources or services, what does it mean to like change the narrative around like people in need and people who have the thing that people need, and instead see this as something where we need each other, and that we are reliant on each other for each other's survival and our ability to thrive in the world, as opposed to like situating it as something where there's like independence or that kind of like hyper enmeshment and codependency, and really striving for this piece where we are building together and see that shared experience of building together as necessary for being able to move through the world in a more collective way. Collective access. And so I think this is where we sometimes think about like universal design as one example of collective access. And so, universal design, the way I think about it and the way I really think through it is no one being left behind in what we build. And so whether that's like the access of the room when we're inviting people to gather in person, or the types of materials we create, or the type of, online programming and who can access those, whether it's like the assumption that everyone has internet or that everyone drives a car, like really thinking through who's left behind based on the kinds of things we build and shape, and trying our best to ensure that we are creating multiple ways for people to access in a collective way. And then lastly, collective liberation. And so, I think that for me is really, there is no liberation without Black liberation, and there is no liberation without each other centered in that work. And so we need each other to be able to live in the world where there is freedom and justice. And that can be a hard, hard thing to build, especially when we've been taught to be so factioned and so separate from each other by design. And so disability justice is recognizing that we need each other to build anything that we want that moves us towards a future with more freedom. So it's a lot. There's more there. I didn't read each one. That's why I offer this to you to come back to it, because there is so much in each one of these descriptions I hope that you spend time with. And I've seen a lot of organizations really think through how to bring this into their work. And in my resource page and is the Northwest Health Foundation's Disability Justice Audit Tool, which is a really, really great tool to look through how your organization is actually showing up in these ways. And so that's just one way where you can take this kind of theoretical piece and think through how it actually gets integrated into your work and do that assessment part. So I just want to offer that now, because I think sometimes it's like, oh, great, I have all this information, but like, what do we do with it, right? So, I think some of the questions I hope we're asking ourselves in thinking about this concept is, how do these principles clarify or complicate my understanding of what justice might look like or could mean for disabled community, or really any community? How do I start putting these principles into practice? What makes disability justice in practice hard or exciting or uncomfortable or beautiful? And start really like sitting with those questions and thinking through like, how can this actually be part of how I think about my work, my life, my relationships, my commitments, and my values? And so I think this is my last quote. It's not about self-care, it's about collective care. Collective care means shifting our organizations to be ones where people feel fine if they get sick, cry, have needs, start late because the bus broke down, move slower. Ones where there's food at meetings, people work from home, that these things aren't things we apologize for. It's the way we do the work, which centers disabled, femme of color ways of being in the world, where many of us have often worked from our sick beds, our kids' beds, our too crazy to get out today beds, where we actually care for each other and don't leave each other behind, which is what we started with, right? And so that's, another quote from the book I referenced before, and really just thinking through, like, what does it mean to be building something collective? And I think the pandemic has really showed us, a lot of our successes in being able to do that, and also some of our pain points. And I think spaces where we can likely do more, and take the time to really think through what will actually work for our communities that we are part of. So some strategies and practices that I offer: make the commitment to disability justice and follow it with action. I know that's like one sentence, but I think so many folks try to put things in that action without maybe a really concrete sense of what they're trying to aim for. And then other groups make the commitment and don't follow with action. So what does it mean to do both, right? And, you know, to borrow the language of Adrienne Marie Brown, small is all. We're not trying to accomplish everything all at once, just making that small step that will be that piece of incremental change that builds towards something greater and bigger. As I mentioned, capitalism hurts people, and so does ableism. Understanding this, saying this, demonstrating this, and also how we will work against this in our work is one piece that can really, I think, show to our communities, especially our communities that are under-resourced, that we get this piece and how it deeply impacts what our experiences are within our bodies. Be open to feedback and create meaningful and accessible channels to receive feedback. So I think about that, the difference between like comment cards that no one reads versus actually, you know, inviting people to be in the room, whatever kind of room, but being in the room and sharing that feedback and wanting that feedback, integrating that feedback. Providing access information, whether that's like, hey, there will or won't be ASL, or, you know, this really great event is happening in a building that only has stairs, whatever that might mean, to help people understand what is realistic about that space and that opportunity. Share roles and increase support. So how can we support each other in the work that we're trying to do to support increasing both access and opportunity for people, and sharing those responsibilities so they don't center on one person, so that it's a collective practice. Designate an access committee. There's really great examples of groups that have access committees that think through everything that their work does through the lens of access, and doesn't deprioritize this to like, you know, a last minute thing, or, you know, oh, we forgot that, like actually giving people the responsibility to think through it. Don't isolate folks. And so this is more like in-person events where unfortunately some folks are like, oh, we'll just put all the people in wheelchairs in this one spot. And what that does is it doesn't assume that folks in wheelchairs and wheelchair users might have community and family and friends that they want to be a part of that event at. And so just thinking about how we cannot like assume that like there just needs to be one place versus like integrating it into what we offer. Including and prioritizing disabled folks in planning as core leaders. And so, you know, that again is like, how do we actually shift power, give up power, so that the folks who know best are part of who's making the decisions. Reflect on our own access needs and normalize these. So as an educator, as someone who organizes, I start every meeting that I facilitate asking what our access needs are. And on Zoom, a lot of that looks like, I'm going to be off video because I have a migraine, but I want to be here. Or my back really hurts and I'm going to be pacing, you know, or my kid is sick and I'm going to have to go between, but I'm doing everything I can to be present. And I need folks to understand that that's my access need and normalize those and not shame people for them, and understand that access needs are something that we all have that help us be where we want to be. Hold compassion for ourselves and everyone else. Simple to say, harder to do. What does compassion actually mean within the work that we do that doesn't become sympathy, but instead empathy, right? And not just like creating this idea of us and, you know, us and them. Universal design, concept and practice, like I mentioned. Invest in disability justice as a practice now, not just a someday goal. So, you know, if your takeaway from this is like, oh, we have work to do, it's and like, it would be great to be somewhere, you know, with this, it's like, okay, what can you do today, right? What can you do in the next 24 hours that's going to make a commitment to actually exploring this more? More accessible spaces, some tips here. So outreach, how are you doing your outreach? How can this be increased and shifted? You know, are you using only online platforms? Are you asking community members to get the word out about things? Are you relying on the, you know, people having internet? You know, what are those different aspects of outreach that really only go so far, and how do you increase that through changing different kinds of channels of communication? Same with written materials. Are they, do you have access to putting written materials in Braille? Do you have access to ASL, translators or interpreters that, could be available to support any of the materials that you only have written right now? Image description and audio descriptions. So image descriptions are often used in like social media to describe what is happening. So someone using a screen reader can have those descriptions read. Audio descriptions are for folks who are going to attend something that can't see, like this slide deck. So like in the description of most of my slides, I have a image description, but I could also have an audio clip so someone could listen to that. ASL and CART, microphones, there's this joke in disabled community, at least in mine, like of the person who's like, I don't need a microphone because their voice is loud enough. Use a microphone, have a microphone when you can. Understandably, many of these things takes resources, but there are microphones out there. I will personally help any group you're part of find a microphone if that's what it takes. Bathrooms, both accessible, gender inclusive, family friendly. Like, I think sometimes we make assumptions that those bathrooms work for everyone, but we've all been in bathroom stalls that like don't open very big, like, and the disabled bathroom is broken, right? So like actually being thorough. Wheelchair and other mobility related access. So, there's wheelchairs, but there's also canes, there's walkers, there's mobility scooters, there's scooters that need to be charged. There's all different things like that sometimes we make an assumption that there's like one right way to have a mobility access tool or how they might operate in the space. I've been in spaces where things are wheelchair accessible except for like, the table where you get to meet the person at the end of the event. Name, pronouns, and access check-ins, like I mentioned. Scent and chemical exposure. I work at PSU and we're a scent-free campus, which I think is pretty progressive. And I encourage folks to think about what it means to incorporate that. I myself am, I have health conditions that are triggered by being around any chemical scent and any high scented products, including natural essential oil-based scents. And so what does it mean to consider that and ask people to go as low scent as possible and provide resources for people to be able to make other scent choices, scent-free choices. Food, always offering food. Can't stress this enough. I know it's hard in COVID times, but how do we talk about the relationship between food and our access needs? Directions, transportation, and parking. We so often rely on Google Maps, but what would it mean to include like actual written description of like how to navigate through a building to get somewhere? Sometimes we put up signs, sometimes we don't. We just expect people to figure it out. Lighting can be really hard for different kinds of folks' access needs. So actually thinking through like, can you make other lighting choices? Same with quiet spaces. Are there rooms you can have available for someone who needs to take a breather from what's going on and have another quiet area? Video conferencing and live streaming, we're all familiar with that now. Schedule and time management. So, for folks who like take the bus, for instance, it's so important to know when things start. So that's can be like, hey, it's from 2 to 5, but the actual program starts at 2:45 and will end at 4:15. Things like that help people make real decisions that allow everyone to know upfront how to plan and works against that urgency and that sense of like everyone has the same access. And then lastly, transparency. And so I think this is easy to say, just like transparency, be transparent. But I think for me, what I've seen be really successful is when people are really transparent about what they can't or can't do in the moment that they're in right now. And so, for instance, I saw some events recently by a group I really admire who posted ahead of the event like, hey, our ASL person was sick and can't be here. We're not going to be able to offer this. We know that that's not enough. We are sorry that we're not able to offer it. We want you to know this ahead of time, and we're committed to figuring this out. If you have feedback about this, like, here's a way to give us feedback. We are open to suggestions for more people to have on deck for next time. Like, we're committed, like, very honest, right? And not necessarily being defensive, like, hey, we're not able to do that. And we're sorry, is really different than like just not even acknowledging that it happened. Or just assuming that no one's really going to need that to begin with. And so I think that's one example. I think another example is like, hey, we can't control the lighting in this space. So we just need you to know that ahead of time, right? Because sometimes we are limited with the resources and the spaces we have. And so being transparent in those ways allows people to have their ability to self-determine what will work for them, and to then make asks, around like, hey, if me and my friends all bring 10 lamps, can we switch to that instead, right? And like actually being creative, and being open to that kind of creativity when it's possible within the limits of what we can do. So to wrap up, I have some questions for you all to consider. So what are ways we can put this into practice? What's the inner work, the reflection and actions, the shift, grow, and change must we do to strengthen our commitment to disability justice? How can we integrate disability justice into our daily lives and model this for others? What can we do to end ableism, both internal, relational, structural, et cetera, within our organization and our work? And so, I'm curious what you all would say to these, right? And so this is for you all to take, from here. And then I offer this as a kind of quick snapshot of a bunch of different disabled activists of color internationally that are doing this work. I think sometimes you hear from like one person like myself and you're like, a concept, but to really like see the breadth of people that are out there right now doing this work together to move the needle on this, I think is a really important visual piece to help us really bring this home. And so within the slide notes, there's everyone's names of the folks in these photos. And I encourage you to Google them, learn about their work, so that you can really feel resourced in the community and the activists who are really championing our societal change around disability and disabled community. Resources. So Disability Justice Curriculum by Project Let's is really comprehensive and great. Sins Invalid I referenced before, Care Work I referenced before. Disability Visibility First Person Stories from the 21st Century by Alice Wong is an anthology of some really awesome essays. Resistance and Hope, essays by disabled people as well. Critiques, another anthology. The Irresistible podcast episodes on disability justice, the Disability Justice Audit Tool from Northwest Health Foundation. I have made into PDF this book, Skin, Tooth, and Bone, The Basis of Movement is Our People, for you to access. I recommend also buying it from Sins Invalid, but I wanted you all to have a really comprehensive tool that you can look at. And so I think you can see my screen right now, but it's got all kinds of access suggestions, looking through different kinds of community that speak to their experience, including like autism, around like hearing access versus deaf community, calls to action, different kinds of perspectives on disability justice. It's really awesome. I recommend it. I think I've said awesome like 4 times, so apologies. KIP Kinship, the Disability Justice Arts and Activism of Sins Invalid is another great resource. An Ableism Bingo, which is kind of tongue-in-cheek, like, does your organization, say these things and not actually follow through, which can be a nice little like, oh yeah, maybe we have some work to do kind of resource. And then lastly, a great article about some white supremacy culture and the work of Tema Akun, and looking at that combined with disability justice on how do those overlap, and talking about like, how do we really address dominant culture within our spaces? And this is one way to kind of see how they intersect. So I will stop sharing and pause here for questions, reflections. We got 5 minutes. I throw so much at you. And
Really,
yeah, would love any thoughts if you have them.
thank you, Corey, so much. This was great and some great resources for us to take next steps. I know that I would win ableism bingo, and that's not a good thing. I have work to do. I had no agenda with this presentation. I really want us to just continue to learn. I'm not going to send an email tomorrow of an epic plan that I have. We have our values conversation as a board next month. I certainly this might inspire some of that. This is a board that has been really committed to learning. We got a lot of type A's, which is wonderful. How we push ourselves, how we hold ourselves accountable, and the entire team, and it's right back on us. I think in a really wonderful way. For me, one of my major takeaways is I just have so much work to do on my language. I've just as an example, we think so often that there's something wrong with somebody's body that they can't get into the pool, or they can't get into a rec center. The problem is the rec center. The problem is how it was designed, that it doesn't fit every body. And so I'm on this journey. I have put my foot in my mouth. I'm trying to be gracious with myself and gentle. But I commit to learning. I would love feedback later about if this is something you still want to learn about, and I'm going to let Tia talk.
Thank you, Corey. That was just an amazing. It was very eye-opening and very amazing, and things that we need. Oh, fine. Oh no, you guys not hear me?
Very low.
This one.
There we go.
Thank you, Corey, for your presentation. It was perfect. It's, I think, what we needed, and it's things that we hear little pieces here and there, but bringing it all into focus at one time is also very powerful to see together. I did have a question though. When you mentioned access committee, I was like, wow, that's like such a great thing, like that we can, another advisory committee. My question to you is, with all these different disabilities, invisible disabilities, those kinds of things, intersectionality of disabilities, how do you create a committee that would potentially encompass, because there's so many different things, right? And there's more predominant, majority disabilities of certain things than others, but we want to, when we say access for all, we do want to be access for all, right? We want everybody who wants to enjoy the parks to be able to, but how do we get these voices into these positions or these little committees? How do we get every single input for every single, for such a large breadth of things that we don't even maybe consider, we wouldn't even know as a disability because we haven't, but is somebody identifies it as a disability. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. I would say again, small is all. So maybe not trying to be like, we're going to put a committee together and we're going to that's going to solve the issue of a pool of people that have the answers, right? I would say more what I would recommend is people who have the lived experience and the ability to be good thought partners for the work that you're doing. So it's not about always having the answer, but being able to have the time and resources and space to explore that together. So, for instance, I'm not a wheelchair user. I'm not going to be able to speak to that experience, but I certainly know that wheelchair users are an important group to prioritize and think about. And so there's a lot of resources out there that I can turn to get information, and I don't have to have that specific lived experience. But I would certainly hope that there is someone who is a wheelchair user in that group too, right? So it's you may not be able to achieve that all at once, but even I think having 2 or 3 people whose sole purpose is to explore the resources, the ideas, the knowledge, the information out there, and take whatever case study or situation or opportunity or access point and really think through all the angles is going to be potentially more than what you are doing right now, and I think that's the point, is how do you give it the actual intentionality that maybe hasn't happened to this point. And I'm not speaking specifically to you. I'm like, most people don't have that, right? And so like, what would shift if there was that intentionality of having those people thinking through things?
Thank you.
Thanks for the thoughtful question, Tia.
Yeah.
I know we're out of time. Unfortunately, we have a very packed agenda today and have to hop into executive session. But I guess, one, thank you, obviously, or if not obvious. And, for all my peers, please let Doug or I know if this is something you want to learn more about, if this is something for another future work session. But we're on a journey, and we appreciate Corey giving her time tonight to help us on that journey.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I will add my contact information to the slide deck too. So if you want to send something my way, feel free. I really want to be a resource. So happy to connect further after this as well. So
We appreciate that very much. Have a lovely evening.
yeah, you
Thank
as
you,
well.
Corey.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.